Shareholder Oppression, Causes and Cures. Welcome to Tea at Taxevity, where you get insights from insiders, our many clients and friends. I'm Pramod Sharma, the actuary at Taxevity. I help people who care about sustainable financial independence harness the power of life and health insurance. Our guest today is Albert Frank. Albert, what do you do when you're not being interviewed?
I work hard on suing people who deserve it.
That's a very concise answer. We're talking about shareholders here. We have minority shareholders and majority shareholders. Can you please tell us a little about the two groups?
Well, you could say that the majority shareholders are one or more shareholders who are operating together, voting cooperatively, who have amongst them the majority of the votes. And then the minority shareholders are any one or more persons who, even if you put their votes together, they don't have enough to overrule the majority.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like the problems arise with the minority shareholders.
Well, often, because a lot of what happens is done by management, the directors and officers, and typically they're picked by the majority group.
Yes, that makes sense. What are the common causes of disagreements among shareholders?
Well, sometimes you get minority shareholders who are just unreasonable and trying to go for something they're not entitled to. But often, it really stems from the attitude of management and the majority shareholders. If their attitude is that the minority are the little people, or even worse, the suckers, then they're likely to do things that are harmful and that lead to shareholder disputes. They can be sloppy, arrogant, and troubled in other ways, like sometimes they're crooked.
Okay, let's explore those in a little more detail. So sloppy, what do you mean there?
Well, suppose you haven't held a shareholders meeting in over 2 years. Suppose you've got a bunch of directors and there was never a formal meeting to appoint them. Or if there was, there's no note of it anywhere, and no one can remember when it happened.
Oh.
Or the management decides they're going to buy another company, but they don't get any advice about what sort of price they should pay, and the whole thing is done in a very sloppy way. And then the minority might say, that's a bad deal. And in that case, it might not technically count as what we call oppression, but it could be a fundamental change that would entitle the shareholders to be bought out at the fair value of their shares.
Okay. You also mentioned arrogance as one of the issues.
Well, let's put it this way. People who run companies typically have a lot of self-confidence. They know a lot of things, and they know a lot of things, and they're confident in business. But where it becomes arrogant is that when they imagine, because they've got all this business knowledge, all these business skills, that they're an expert on everything. And nobody's an expert on everything. And one thing these fellows typically are not an expert on is what their conduct might look like to a judge who's later looking at things not just from the perspective of management, but is looking at being fair to everybody.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you have an example that might help us understand that a little better?
Well, many years ago, over 20 in fact, I acted for an aging minority shareholder. He was the largest minority shareholder. He put a lot of money into the company many years earlier. And for the last several years, he put his name up to be a director every year, and they voted him down every year and basically ignored him at all other times. What he was concerned about is that for many years, he had stopped receiving dividends. But the company was doing very well. And so what the majority group was doing and the management group was doing was they would pay themselves large bonuses that would fluctuate depending how good a year it was. So in effect, instead of paying dividends, they just took any excess profits for themselves. That was not good.
Depends on which side.
In itself, that might or might not have counted as oppression, but once we got into it, we found out they had done other stuff that was bad, including basically hiding a major transaction so that it didn't appear on the audited financial statements, and that really seriously prejudiced the interests of the minority shareholder. And then the whole thing settled.
Okay. You also mentioned the issue of people being crooked. Can you explain that more?
Well, in that particular circumstance, I don't really know if they were crooked or arrogant or what. They might have been crooked, or they might have just been arrogant and sloppy. I mean, once that all came out, it was obvious this thing had to settle.
Mm-hmm. What about the role of greed?
Well, greed could be people believing that all the money should go to them and none to the minority, whereas it should be more even-handed. The minority, they are among the owners of the company. They're supposed to benefit if the company's doing well.
Mm-hmm. What are the best solutions to avoid litigation?
Well, one of them is that don't assume you're an expert on everything. And if you're management and you're not an expert, really, on shareholder relations and the rights of shareholders in law, then before you do anything significant, you really ought to get advice from someone who is. You should take the attitude of, you may not see why the law requires all these things, like annual meetings, but the law does require these things. So if you don't want to bother doing it yourself, get somebody else to do it, but get it done.
What's your main message for the people watching today?
I suppose the main message is, when you're running a company, when you're management or a majority shareholder, try to think of things not just from your own perspective, but from the perspective of all of the shareholders. And for goodness sake, even if you're not interested in legal technicalities yourself, judges could be. So attend to them or get somebody to attend to them for you.
What's the best way for people to reach you?
I'd say either phone call at 416-929-7202 or else email afrank@franklaw.ca.
Thanks for joining us for Tea at Taxevity. The Taxevity Insurance Advisory helps you understand insurance and bridges gaps in your coverage. There's no premium for peace of mind. How healthy is your insurance?